Hello, welcome everyone to another Clear Mountain Monastery Wednesday evening conversation. And this evening we are very happy to have, in addition to Ajahn Nisabho myself, to have the Venerable Tan Tejadhammo from Wat Map Jan in Thailand. And so thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
It's nice to be here.
And living in Thailand, all of us have spent, I think each of us have spent about 5 years, at least 5 years each in Thailand. And it really stretches one's conception of what is Buddhism and what is faith and how one's faith is directed. And that's the general topic of our conversation this evening, is finding the relevant in the far out. Because I think most Westerners, all of us, are born in America, in a non-Buddhist country. I think we'll go a bit into our own spiritual biographies to the extent of talking about our relationships with faith, or with skepticism, with science, and with kind of pushing the boundaries of our own comfort levels. But it's a common thing for American convert Buddhists to not necessarily have the easiest relationship with faith. So just digging into that a bit more, and what happens when our burgeoning faith, or our fledgling faith, starts meeting with things which are kind of testing of that. We see things, or hear about things, or read about things which we never heard about, or read about, or thought about before. And what do we do with that? So maybe if each one of you might be willing, maybe starting with yourself, Ajahn Nisabho, if you're willing to talk about your relationship with faith and the limits of your own faith.
Yeah, thank you. There's a sort of conception in Thai circles that you can have a different sort of type of personality, and this is in the Visuddhimagga too. And greed types who have like strong greed can also, I think there's sort of a connection sometimes between greed and faith, or the idea that greed can mature into faith. And so I think I sort of classify myself as a faith type, and it's always been a really strong quality that I really have appreciated a lot. And I think, there's always the deep resonance with like the Buddhist teachings themselves, but I think with things that are a little more less accepted in Western circles, like rebirth, there was a moment in senior year of high school where I just realized that I knew so many people in my life who had experiences which were somewhat inexplicable, um, that at least I needed to take the idea seriously, and actually kind of put down my disbelief. It was really a dogma of disbelief, because like I'd hear certain studies or this or that and just be like fake science without looking into it at all. And so there's a really conscious moment senior year being like, okay, I'm actually going to be open to this. And as soon as I was, like, the more people I talked to, like people very close to me, had just had experiences of knowing the moment a loved one had died or this and that. And from there, things just grew to the point where I went to Thailand, and really, I think what really cemented my faith was in sort of rebirth, or the unseen, which is, the far out in this conversation for me, at least the beginning of the far out, was a book called Life Before Life, which was one account of Dr. Ian Stevenson's work. He's a professor at the University of Virginia who over 40 years basically took down the life recollective, like found children who could recollect past lives and took down their accounts and then verified them against real world stories with journalists in tow. And he found over like 1,500, 2,000 kids over 40 years at this faculty. And reading his accounts, it was just very hard for me to put it aside. So, we've been very careful about how much we sort of speak about these things with people who might be kind of turned off by them. There were skeptics in the Buddhist time, and he was very clear you didn't have to believe in rebirth to practice. And it is a significant thing that affects our existential situation. And I found at least it's something worth really investigating carefully for ourselves, and actually giving the Buddha that much credit to look into it. And that was the beginning of my faith. And since then, it's kind of grown in a lot of ways that I didn't expect. So yeah, thank you. Ajahn or Tan, Teju?
Yeah, so sharing a bit of my experience with faith and skepticism. So I grew up in an environment where it was fairly normal to talk about, angels, or sort of like a family member who died, about them being in heaven, which I think probably a lot of people would experience. Not everybody, but seemed fairly normal. So I just took it as normal. But also my schooling was heavily science-based by choice. I just loved science. And so that was very much how I would train my mind, and kind of investigate. But also I considered, like, a true scientist to have a very open mind, which feels more relevant to me now. But I remember this very particular experience, kind of having been raised not Buddhist, and then eventually when I was 16, getting into meditation and Buddhism, and then 18, I found out about this retreat where you could temporarily ordain as a Tibetan monastic. But anyhow, that was a month-long retreat, and on that retreat, it was really just breath meditation, very focused on, uh, just basic breath meditation instructions. And um, there was one day the teacher gave a talk about the story of the Buddha. I remember very clearly just thinking, why do we have to talk about this? I just want to talk about the mechanics of breath meditation, just the present moment, and this just doesn't seem relevant. And I was very kind of opposed to this idea of listening to a story of the historical Buddha, which I just, felt like that just wasn't what I was about at the time. But it's really changed a lot since then. I've just kind of heard tidbits gradually, almost 20 years of stories and tidbits, and being also surrounded by people with a lot of faith. Of course, not saying everybody, but certainly in Thailand, there's a lot of faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and heavenly beings and other realms and rebirth and so on. So now I'm at the point where the history of the Buddha, that's just like a baseline. That doesn't even seem like out there at all. And now, things like Devas and rebirth and other realms, now that just feels normal and something I really enjoy. But still, it feels like that attitude of the scientist is still with me, and also that love of trying to understand the mechanics of the mind. So for me, the way those two join together, like being a very faithy type, I would say, and really loving psychic power stories, Deva stories, Buddha, Bodhisattva stories, like all the above. I do genuinely love it, but I also love that scientific viewpoint. So for me, the way they came together was, all right, well, just looking at the mechanics of my own mind. When the object of mind is an inspiring story, or a Buddha or Bodhisattva, or story of a heavenly being, to me, that's an object of the mind in the present moment. And for my mind, it gives rise to feelings of happiness, of faith, of inspiration, giving me energy to practice, and giving rise to kind of, just various wholesome states and views that are in line with the Buddhist teachings. So for me, at the end of the day, because there's always that sense of like, well, do you really know what reality is, or do you really know if Devas, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, like what their true reality in conventional terms is? And it's very, usually the response is like, oh no, I don't know for sure. But what I can tell you is when I bring these objects to mind, it gives rise to kindness, to faith, to belief in the power of actions in the present moment. Another way of saying, belief in karma. And those are just so wholesome and so supportive and uplifting and onward leading mind states that I feel very sort of confident and happy to just say, yeah, I love these stories. And, a lot of them you can't prove, but I always kind of say or tell myself, that's not the point. The point is to cultivate wholesome states and abandon the unwholesome. So that's just a bit.
It reminds me a bit of Ajahn Kovilo. Once, I think we were talking about trying to track down exactly which like parts of the Pali Canon were completely 100% sure the words of the Buddha, and which one might have been later interpolation. And you said like sometimes I put less emphasis on that, and like remember like, the metric I use isn't always like 100% true and 100% false, or there originally and not there, but more like what is useful and what's not at the moment. So, I mean, I'm sure that was said within a context, but what about your journey to faith, Ajahn, or to skepticism, wherever you are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely would have been said in a context. And I mean, a lot of my kind of my growth in faith has been kind of like a faith knock-on kind of effect. Raised, both my parents are Western medical doctors, grew up in Unitarian church, which is very, I mean, Unitarianism has lots of different flavors, but the church that I grew up in was quite humanist. So definitely very materialist, humanist, rational, which is great. And I feel like that gives one a lot of grounding in, rigorous, looking at reality. But then doing a meditation retreat when I was in my early 20s, and then just having that totally, just seeing how fragile and kind of weak my mind was, basically sitting for 10 hours a day, 10 days, and then just saying, okay, there's something to training the mind. And so that was the initial spark of faith. Okay, I have faith that I'm really deluded, and I've got faith that it's possible to do something about that, and faith in the particular method, watching the breath, watching the changing bodily sensations. And then from that start, I find the meditation retreat was framed in a very not at all religious framework, which is great because I didn't want a religion, and it didn't really talk about religion, and it doesn't need to talk about religion. And I didn't want it to talk about religion. So that was great. All those things lined up. But then, learn actually the method was being taught from the Pali Canon, start growing in faith in the Pali Canon. And fortunately, the site that I was visiting was Access to Insight, which is primarily translated at that time by Tan Tejadhammo, an American monk, who is choosing self-selecting suttas, which are, relevant to meditation, very rational teachings, which don't really stretch the imagination or stretch the faith faculty, but just enough, So basically, okay, I've got faith in meditation, then faith in the Pali Canon, start learning Pali, then faith in these other suttas. Okay, if this body of texts teaches this really useful meditation technique, this way of looking at the body, maybe these things about past lives, maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's things it talks about devas or angels or other realms or the possibility of enlightenment. Like all of these are things which one has to either take on faith or not take on faith. And so I start becoming agnostic about those, whereas formerly I had faith in my own skepticism about them. So then becoming agnostic, and then just seeing over the years in our ordain, faith in the path of monasticism, faith in enlightenment, and then just more and more seeing, like, as you were mentioning, Ajahn Nisabho, like the beauty of people who have faith living in Thailand, and just seeing the beauty of faith, and that being so easy to see at times. But then also seeing the drawbacks of kind of a ngom ngai, which is like the Thai word for like blind faith. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, also seeing not necessarily the beauty, but the utility and perhaps accuracy of a skeptical mind about things, but also seeing the limits, the drawbacks of that. So seeing the advantages and the drawbacks, both of faith and of skepticism. And people who are just like too faithy in my eyes, I don't have faith in that. But also people who are too skeptical, I can't get down with that either. So like finding this, there's got to be a place in the middle. And I feel like having good friends like yourselves, like we're all kind of like finding our way and trying to find like a beautiful way, and not just going with our own predetermined beliefs, but actually like opening up to scripture or to teachers or to our own deeper experiences that aren't necessarily just fixed in a logical materialist view of things. So, yeah.
Ajahn, that's a really, thank you. And, this, one of the questions that kind of dovetails on it, if I may, that is, Sarah was saying, what is faith in Buddhist terms? Seems something other than belief. Could you discuss? And you just mentioned how, you'd sort of said faith, but not being attached necessarily to your own beliefs. So there is a distinction you're making there that's in line with that question. So just to bring that question up for both of you, if you have any comments on it.
Oh, yeah.
Please. What is faith in Buddhism, and how does it differ from belief?
Yeah, so just a caveat, I don't necessarily know the answer to this, but I'll just answer my understanding, and the Ajahns are welcome to correct me if I say anything wrong. So my experience of faith, for instance, like I was saying, I do love these kind of various stories, recollecting Buddhas or Bodhisattvas or Devas, heavenly beings. So for instance, if I think of the Buddha, bring the Buddha to mind, and we're taught to recollect the great purity, great compassion, great wisdom of the Buddha. So just bringing that to mind, and it's could be an image, could be like a physical shrine or statue one has seen in the past or what have you. And that's something I do, and that I was taught. It's kind of seeing the Buddha as a mental image, and then that's a way to bring the mind to recollect those qualities, and just vast purity, vast compassion, vast wisdom, and the mind is uplifted. It's bright. It's recollecting something beautiful and wholesome, and just utterly good. And then the mind just can stay with that. Can just stay bright and happy, bringing to mind good qualities. And to me, it feels like the movement of mind is lifting the mind up, bringing it to brightness, and the mind can happily stay applied to that. And so that's, if you want to use the term samadhi, or, terms like application of mind or sustained thought, whatever you want, rapture, happiness can arise, stuff like that. So to me, that, is faith. And I don't actually usually define that word to myself. So this is kind of I've never heard myself say these things. So this is new to me as well. But yeah, so it is different than belief, because in that moment, what is the mind believing? And I would say, well, it's not believing anything, actually. It's just bringing a wholesome object to mind and being inspired and uplifted by it. I think there is belief in Buddhism, but I would say that's a different thing. Because you do need belief. Like when the Buddha says, oh, action has result. Action is valuable and important, and the actions you do in the present moment are important, such as cultivating mindfulness, or, for instance, following the 5 precepts, stuff like that. And to me, that's something that for instance, for myself, my understanding is if you don't know that for yourself, like if you don't know that action has a result, if you don't know that the precepts are valuable, it's something you just have to take on faith, or have to believe if you want to, or not. I think have to is the wrong word, but it's something that if you wanted to practice it, you would just believe it and try it out for yourself to see, like, is what the Buddha said true? So there's basically it's a stage of practice where you don't know if the teaching is true yet, but you feel like it sounds reasonable enough, or you have, there's different reasons why you'd try it out, but there's that sense of, okay, I'm going to try this out, which involves some degree of belief, or I think faith is involved in that kind of belief as well. So the terms get mixed in that sense. But, and I feel like that is very important, because if you didn't have sufficient faith and belief to try these things out, like when the Buddha says, oh, when you look at the breath, the mind can become peaceful, radiant, and happy. And when you see things as impermanent, stressful, not self, the mind can become, the bonds of attachment can start to fall away, and you can feel very free. It's like, well, if you just hear that, you don't know if it's true. You have to try it out for yourself. So there's that intermediate stage of, I believe that enough, and it sounds reasonable enough that let me try it out. So that is not a thorough explanation, but that's one set of thoughts.
Yeah, as you were talking about, that kind of brought to mind this idea of just like a working hypothesis, what you're taking. But at the same time, two aspects which you were bringing up, which I feel are really important about Buddhist faith, is that it's true. So faith in true things. So philosophical terms, it's ontological. They're ontologically true. So the Buddha would not have encouraged like a faith in things which just weren't true. Like the things which he's purported to have spoken about would have been actually true. And then at the same time, they would have been beneficial, like you're saying, like pragmatically useful as well. So like when I believe this hopefully true thing, it leads to joy, and it leads to rapture, and it leads to peace, and it really leads to concentration and seeing things the way they are. And I feel like balancing those two things, like truth with functionality, are really like how the characteristics and like function of faith. Do you have any insights on that, Ajahn Nisabho, or other ways you wanted to guide the conversation, or specific thoughts about how faith has been pushed? Very open question.
It's so open in the best way. Yeah. It strikes me that I think the idea of it as a working hypothesis is true, and Ajahn Nisabho says as much. Like, and there's a sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 95, I think, where it's like
Chunky.
Yeah, Chunky Sutta, and basically the Buddha really says, like, Brahman asks the Buddha, like, how do you protect truth? And the Buddha says, when one has faith, one says, I have faith. When one believes something because they approve of a teaching, one says, I believe in something because I approve of it. But one does not yet say, and he goes on through a few other means, but one does not yet say, only this is true, everything else is false. And then basically, eventually, he talks about the realization of truth, which is really just when you encounter awakening for yourself. And what I find significant there is, that the Buddha's care and precision with really defining terms. And, I've heard Ajahn Jayasara say this is the way towards world peace among religions, is everyone saying, like, we have faith, but we don't really know, and that distinction between that quality of constrained, circumscribed, taking on a mode of practice or view, seems so different than belief for me. And it's even in the words, like belief has this like plosives, and like belief, and it like ties itself and has sharp boundaries, where faith, it's like it begins softly, it rises up, and it just dissolves in this. It's much more open. And I think the one other thing to put out there is, we always want this like unshakable edifice, but there's a really interesting theorem called Bohl's theorem, which is basically a mathematical proof that any system complex enough to have internal logic will not be able to prove every axiom it rests on, which basically means every belief system has some a priori belief resting at its heart. Like, there's always something that you can't prove. And the follow-up question here said, what's faith in the context of the Kalama Sutta? And in that sutta, the Buddha really speaks about, like, one says, does this belief lead to good mind states, and do the wise praise it? And, it's not a perfect metric, because, like, how do you know who's wise? How do you exactly know what's perfect? But it's kind of the Buddha's acknowledgement for me of saying, like, okay, this is good enough. Like, we're going to work with what we have. Until you achieve awakening, you can't prove everything like 100%, but this is good enough for practice. And that like circumscribed and functional and brightening view of faith is like beautiful. And I don't, I know we try to translate it as confidence in the West often, but I feel like that does miss a real important quality of love in it. Like there's something very beautiful about it. And it's sad that it's been saddled with such baggage in the West, so. What are your thoughts, Ajahns? Anything?
I'm curious if we can make it's a really nice conversation, but maybe just like bring it like more personal, maybe even more specific, like with the examples. I mean, certain things which like a Western, like most scientists would not, acknowledge the existence of Devas, acknowledge the existence of other realms, might have questions about the possibility of enlightenment, the possibility of a mind totally pure, free from greed, anger, and delusion, the existence of psychic powers, which are, have reading the minds of other people. And I'm curious if either of you would be willing to speak about your process, if it was a process, like for how do you go to Thailand and, for me, I mean, I'm just reading about these things, coming to monasteries in America before going to Thailand. I'm just reading about these things in sutta, in books. So like if I'm not inspired yet, I can just put the book down and just like go with the things that I already think are, unquestionable. Whereas yourselves, maybe you're in Thailand, these things are coming up. What was your process to how to relate to these things, which maybe you haven't seen?
No, great question, Ajahn. Just recollecting my history of coming to Buddhism, and also speaking to some of what was just said. There was that sense, which I've heard from a lot of Western Buddhists, or people that don't identify as Buddhists as well, but that sense of when I was younger, I was told or asked to believe certain things without being presented with any kind of rigorous system of, why should I believe it? Or is it provable? Has anyone proven it? Does anyone know for sure if that's true? Or are we all just believing it in the same way? And that was uncomfortable for me. I didn't like being asked to believe things without some kind of framework or system of like, all right, why? What's the purpose? Like, is it provable? How would it be provable? And so on. So anyway, so that coming to Buddhism, which I've heard from many people, very true for myself, that sense of, okay, well, there is some degree of being asked to believe, like we're talking about, but that sense of everything that is in the Buddhist teachings, or everything that's related to the path and the goal, which is what I was interested in. I said, oh, I want to not suffer. I want to know what the happiness of the Buddha is. And the way it's presented in the teachings, I think, as we all know, is you can know the happiness of the Buddha for yourself. You can know the end of suffering for yourself. And if you just follow these steps, you know it for yourself in your own mind. And it's something that people can tell you about, and people do tell you about it, like, there are teachers that are, will teach these things, but at the end of the day, you know it for yourself. And when you know it for yourself, then that's beyond faith or belief. That's just what it is. So that to me was really important, that sense of like everything you're being asked to look at or believe in, you can know for yourself, you can prove to yourself. And maybe on day one of practicing Buddhism, you might not be able to prove the possibility of nibbana or the possibility of deep samadhi based on the breath. Like maybe not. I mean, maybe yes, which is great. But most, like myself and most people, know you have to take some time. And that's sort of up to, I think, different characters will find it easier to sustain effort long enough to find those results for themselves. But for myself, there was sufficient sort of experiences in meditation where it was really a gradual process of like, oh, this little thing the Buddha taught, I just saw for myself. And then, some period, weeks, months, years, whatever, be like, oh, well, now this thing I also see for myself to some degree. And then this thing, and then this thing. And then there were still those things that I hadn't been able to prove to myself. But I thought, well, all this other stuff I've been able to see for myself that I previously had not been able to see for myself. And that was very inspiring, where I thought, well, if all this other stuff seemed like is true in my own experience, just directly verified, like for instance, the power of the 5 precepts as a support for the peaceful mind, just which seems very basic, but or generosity leading to happiness, and just basic things. I was like, wow, well, maybe nibbana, maybe the happiness of the Buddha is achievable if we follow what he said. And that to me was really inspiring, that that like this was provable, and I wasn't being asked to believe things that I couldn't, at least at some point, verify for myself. So to me that was very important, and that honestly, that in itself gave me more faith in Buddhism, that whoever conceived of this philosophical system, or whatever you want to call Buddhism, had the wisdom to sort of frame it in a very structured way that to me was like just made sense, and like, okay, it's step by step, it's all provable, like it takes time, which makes sense. Like if I could see it all for myself on day one, maybe it wouldn't be that valuable. So it just resonated with my heart, like, yeah, this just sounds right, which is why I guess I had the faith to continue practicing, continue testing it. And just a note on Devas, if I may.
Yeah.
Always universal green light on that one.
But I find, that's often a sticking point of like, yeah, because there's a lot of Devas in the Pali Canon, which is considered like, the conservative foundational, texts for our tradition, Theravada Buddhism. And that can seem kind of far out, or like, well, hey, is that provable? Which is a good question, because it's just permeated throughout the Pali Canon, and also throughout, honestly, the teachings of the great masters in Asia. It's just pervasive, which can be challenging. And I'm not saying anyone has to face that right now if you don't like that. Or, for myself, I was like, never mind, let's look at the breath for 5 or 10 years first. And that was great. But then later, like, I started to just have this, and to me, like the way I settled on it, because also how a lot of people have experiences of seeing visions, seeing different things, different experiences in meditation, and they say, how do I explain this? How do I understand this? And the thing that always made sense to me, or was helpful to me, was, all right, so let's say, for instance, you see a kind of radiant, beautiful, angelic being in your mind during meditation, and it feels very like loving and peaceful and radiant and uplifting. And this is, not everybody. It's not, you don't need that experience, but a lot of people get doubts about this. Like, yeah, what's up with that? And like, why do I have or not have this kind of thing? But to me, that at the end of the day, it was, all right, well, imagery and sound, if you hear things like imagery and sound is imagery and sound. It is what it is. And maybe it's true, maybe it's not, maybe, and one's interpretation of it may or may not be accurate. But that, to me, what it came down to is the mind state when that happens. And just look at your mind and just say, is the mind radiant? Is it expansive? Is it filled with loving kindness and happiness and peace? And I feel like that is an experience that no one can take away from you, and you don't have to doubt. Say, in that moment, I felt, yeah, radiant, heavenly peace and bliss and love. And I'd say, okay, like, that's great. Just, enjoy that memory and that experience. And, the imagery is like, yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. I think the way Ajahn Anan, my teacher, and where Ajahn Nisabho and I both ordained at his monastery, what he would say is, don't believe it, don't not believe it, don't be heedless. Just be aware. And sometimes you get sort of important or relevant teachings or information in meditation, and sometimes it can trick you. So he said, don't just immediately discard it, but don't immediately believe it. But he said the one thing which I really love, he said, the one thing that you never have to doubt is don't cling. And that just, settled right in. I thought, okay, I can go with that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Ajahn Anan mic drop.
Totally. Yeah, he does that sometimes. Yeah. So.
We got a lot of questions. I would love to hear your perspectives on it. You can also pick a question, but
I'm having trouble finding one. I'll say something briefly. I think what Tan Tejadhammo said was beautiful. And I think, there's a sutta called the Kaccayana Sutta, where the Buddha says, like, he brings it right back down to the Four Noble Truths, basically, or even just the first. He says, like, one knows this is dukkha, or the first and third, and this is the cessation of dukkha. To this extent, there is right view. And to this extent, one's view is independent of others. And I love how, the Buddha does lay out a complex cosmology and workings of karma. And yet he also gives this foundational he rests the teaching not on all that all the time, but rather on this edifice of like the Four Noble Truths and something that's undoubtable, because there's nothing more that's imbued with more certainty than one's own pain and then lack of pain. Like that is the most certain or not certain thing, and or most certain thing. And that ability to come back there again and again, and to notice the bright mind, which is free of dukkha, and to steer by that metric was such a gift when we don't know the other things or the other kind of landmarks for sure. And yet, I do sometimes get I don't think it's fair to dismiss such things as devas and stuff as unscientific. And I don't think you were doing this, but science is defined like we take a circle of experts and they form the lens through which we see the world. Like most of us have never seen a virus up close and personal, but we know experts who have microscopes and we trust them. And similarly with certain phenomena, say past lives or things like that, I think it's gotten dismissed as sort of random and happenstance because in the West, we haven't developed the technology. We don't have the microscopes. But you go into these cultures where people have developed samadhi over millennia, and independently, like these teachers have verified something very similar with that same technology of the mind. And so you get an institution like the Sangha, where that technology is cultivated consistently to a great degree. And you do get many experts verifying the same thing again and again and again and again across timeframes, across cultures. And I think that qualifies as science and scientific method to a great extent. So just a thought on that. Do you have any thoughts, either of you? And I'll try to find a question in the meantime.
Yeah, no, I just think it's why I find this conversation so beautiful, in that mentioning of Buddhist technology really is really convincing for me. I mean, the whole conversation is bringing me back to the Buddhist simile of, in the Simsapa forest. You go to this forest of these Simsapa trees with really small leaves. The Buddha picks up a handful of these leaves and he says, which is bigger, the leaves in my hand? Which are more, the leaves in my hand or the leaves in the forest? And the monks say the ones in the forest are much more. The Buddha says, so too, that which I've seen and known from my enlightenment are like the leaves in the forest. That which I teach is like the leaves in my hand. But what we're talking about are like, obviously the Four Noble Truths, one's own suffering is very clearly in the hand. You don't need much, you don't need any faith really to accept your own suffering, over then to assume that you're not, just a complete like robot or something. But it's like the leaves that are like falling off of the hand. Like as you mentioned, Tan Tejadhammo, like there's numerous mentions of devas in this month's daily sutta, reading from readingfaithfully.net or org or something. Recommend that for everybody. Sign up for the daily sutta emails, and every month there's a different theme, and this month is on gods, on devas. And it comes up a lot. This is something which was in the Buddha's hand, and saying that at least like prodding us a little bit, like, okay, start with the ones we can accept, dukkha, the suffering and the causes of suffering. But then what do I think? And letting like one's own friends, one's teachers, one's books kind of prod, okay, maybe rebirth is something, maybe it's not conclusive, but the Ian Stevenson's data from University of Virginia, maybe it is a body of evidence which is suggestive that it's a possibility. These psychic phenomenon, maybe my teacher is honest enough that what he says, he seems very trustworthy in all these other ways. The Buddha, the Pali Canon, seems very trustworthy in all these other ways, kind of expanding one to look at these leaves that are falling off the hand. Any juicy stories? I know we probably have other good questions, but I really want the juice of these leaves, like aloe.
I like the leaves falling off the hand analogy. Tejadhammo.
Yeah, if I may, just a couple of quick things that came to mind, especially with regard to what was just said. I really do love that confluence of remembering what the Buddha said, like, I just only teach one thing, suffering and its end. And then you look at all these suttas about cosmology, devas, other realms, rebirth. And then just that, again, that investigation of, okay, well, why would he teach that if he only taught this one thing? And for me, that was a really rich investigation as, again, more of a character that loves faithy things, and just seeing that connection of why stories about these things are conducive to liberation and what they have to do with suffering and its end. And that to me was just this just utterly beautiful confluence of seeing how those stories are helpful, which basically could go on for probably hours about why it's helpful, but just in a short way. One aspect of it that I think I've touched on is just that faith in the power of action, and how rebirth in other realms, just noticing what's the effect on the mind to think that, the body isn't the full stop end of one's experience of life. And just, again, like, not saying, yeah, you have to believe that, but just like thought experiment. What would it be like if I thought that experience continued after the body disintegrated? What effect does that have? And to me, that's actually very important, because if I don't believe that, then physical death would just be the end of suffering, be super easy. But that's not at all what the Buddha taught, or at least that's one way to understand that viewpoint. But just that sense of, oh, well, if you believe that, then yeah, action actually has meaning, and what we do in the present moment really matters. And so it actually matters to apply the mind to basically the Buddhist teachings of, dana, virtue, or generosity, virtue, and meditation. And I will share maybe one yet more personal anecdote, which is I, just to share, I've had a couple pretty vivid near-death experiences in my life, which sort of say somewhat hesitantly, because I don't want people to think that's sort of like where I'm totally coming from, because I don't feel that way at all. Like, honestly, after these experiences, I was like, okay, that's cool. It didn't really feel like it changed my attitude that much. But there was that sense of, if someone were to suggest, yeah, the body's all there is and the mind there's not anything else, then, there's that direct experience of, well, no, there was this other thing that was vivid and real and sort of undeniable, that was experienced. And again, just noticing what was the effect on the mind of those personal experiences I had. Well, the effect was, loving kindness, gratitude, motivation to do things that are valuable and useful to myself and others. So it's like, okay, maybe the experience was just total fluff and not based in reality, but it was vivid, inspiring, filled with metta, and it motivated me to do good things. So I'll take that,
Dude, there must have been some kind of psychic phenomenon going on. It felt like it was just 5 minutes, but it's actually
Right.
6:45, and it's the end of our time. Gosh, and so many questions it looks like that we weren't able to get to. But Ajahn Nisabho just posted our Zoom meeting link, so that's the next stop, and that is a more interactive venue, and we can all go over there, and anybody who wants to can join us there for more continued conversation. Tan Tejadhammo will be heading back to Thailand literally tomorrow, and we'll miss you. And hope to come back very soon.
Come back and visit.
Thank you. It's been a lovely visit.
And we'll see everyone else later. I'll be there at St. Mark's this weekend, and then we'll just continue on with the normal Clear Mountain schedule. So, good night, everybody.